In the grand halls of Ravenshollow Palace, where secrets hide behind golden portraits and whispered conversations echo through marble corridors, a 15-year-old princess would soon discover that the most dangerous truths are often found in the most unexpected places. What started as a simple request to borrow a car would unravel a web of deception that reached the very heart of the monarchy, forcing a loyal guard to choose between his oath to the crown and his duty to justice. Sometimes the smallest discoveries can topple the mightiest thrones. Princess Isabella Victoria Ashworth had always been different from other royal children. At 15, she possessed an unusual curiosity that often worried her tutors and delighted her father, King Edmund. Unlike her older brother Prince Marcus, who seemed content with ceremonial duties and public appearances, Isabella asked uncomfortable questions and noticed things others preferred to ignore. Her sharp green eyes missed nothing, and her quick mind connected dots that others left scattered. The kingdom of Eldoria had seen better days. Once a prosperous nation known for its democratic monarchy and progressive policies, recent years had brought economic challenges and political tensions. King Edmund, beloved by his people for 30 years, had remarried 5 years ago to Lady Catherine Whitmore, a wealthy widow from a neighboring kingdom. The marriage had been both political and personal, designed to strengthen alliances and bring much-needed foreign investment to Eldoria. Catherine had transformed from Lady Whitmore to Queen Catherine with remarkable ease, quickly establishing herself as a force within the palace. She brought with her not only substantial wealth, but also strong opinions about how the monarchy should operate. Her influence over King Edmund was obvious to everyone, though most courtiers were careful to speak of it only in hushed tones behind closed doors. On this particular autumn morning, the palace buzzed with preparation for the annual Harvest Festival, Eldoria's most important cultural celebration. Princess Isabella had requested permission to drive herself to the village to personally inspect the preparations, a request that had sparked considerable debate among her security detail. At 15, she had only recently received her driving license, and protocol dictated that royals should always travel with full security escorts. Captain James Morrison, head of the Royal Protection Service, had served the crown for 12 years. A former military officer with an impeccable record, Morrison was known throughout the palace for his unwavering integrity and absolute loyalty to the royal family. He had protected King Edmund through numerous threats, both foreign and domestic, and had earned the complete trust of everyone in the family. Everyone, that is, except Queen Catherine. From the moment Catherine had arrived at the palace, there had been an unspoken tension between her and Captain Morrison. She had made several attempts to have him reassigned, citing concerns about security protocols and suggesting that fresh leadership might benefit the protection service. Each time, King Edmund had politely but firmly declined her suggestions, making it clear that Morrison's position was secure. This had only served to deepen the animosity between the Queen and the captain. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the breakfast room as Princess Isabella made her request to borrow one of the palace vehicles. King Edmund, reviewing state papers while sipping his morning tea, looked up with the patient expression of a father who had grown accustomed to his daughter's independent spirit. Queen Catherine, elegant in her morning attire, set down her coffee cup with just enough force to create a small clink against the saucer. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed once against the table before she spoke, her voice carrying the refined accent she had cultivated during her years in diplomatic circles. The discussion that followed revealed the careful dynamics that governed the royal household. King Edmund, ever the diplomat, sought to balance his daughter's desire for independence with the security concerns raised by both his wife and his protection detail. Queen Catherine argued for strict adherence to protocol, emphasizing the dangers of allowing a young royal to travel without proper security. Her concerns appeared genuine and motherly, though Isabella detected something else beneath the surface. Captain Morrison found himself in an unusual position. His primary concern was genuinely for the princess's safety, yet he also recognized her need for some degree of normal teenage experience. Moreover, he was acutely aware of Queen Catherine's disapproving gaze and her implicit challenge to his judgment. The tension in the room was palpable as the discussion continued. Isabella listened to the debate with growing frustration. She understood the security concerns, but She also felt suffocated by the constant presence of bodyguards and the formal protocols that governed every aspect of her life. Her request to drive alone to the village was as much about asserting her growing independence as it was about inspecting the festival preparations. The compromise that emerged satisfied no one completely, but offered a solution that addressed the major concerns. Isabella would be allowed to drive one of the smaller palace vehicles, but she would maintain radio contact with the security team and will be followed at a discreet distance by two plainclothes officers. Her destination would be limited to the village center, and she would return within 2 hours. Queen Catherine's expression suggested that she found this arrangement inadequate, but she deferred to her husband's judgment with the grace expected of a royal consort. As she excused herself from the breakfast table, her final glance toward Captain Morrison carried a message that he had no difficulty interpreting. His days of influencing security decisions were numbered if she had anything to say about it. As Isabella prepared for her excursion, she felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This small taste of independence represented something larger to her, a step toward the kind of engaged, accessible monarchy she hoped to help create someday. She had studied other modern monarchies and admired those that had managed to maintain tradition while adapting to contemporary expectations. The vehicle selected for her use was a modest sedan from the palace fleet, chosen for its low profile and reliability rather than any ceremonial significance. As Captain Morrison conducted the final security briefing, he emphasized the importance of maintaining communication and adhering to the agreed-upon timeline. His professional manner masked his own unease about the arrangement, though he trusted Isabella's maturity and good judgment. The drive from the palace to the village normally took 20 minutes along winding country roads that showcased Eldoria's natural beauty. For Isabella, however, this journey represented far more than a simple trip to inspect festival preparations. It was her first real taste of the independence she craved and a chance to connect with her future subjects in a more natural, unguarded way. As she settled behind the wheel of the unfamiliar vehicle, Isabella noticed that the previous driver had left several items in the car. A coffee cup sat in the center console, and some papers were scattered on the passenger seat. She made a mental note to tidy up after herself before returning the vehicle, not wanting to appear careless or entitled. The palace gates opened smoothly as her vehicle approached, and Isabella felt a thrill of anticipation as she drove through them into the world beyond the palace walls. The discreet security escort fell into position behind her, maintaining enough distance to avoid drawing attention while remaining close enough to respond quickly if needed. What Princess Isabella could not have known as she drove toward the village that morning was that the seemingly innocent papers left in the car would soon reveal secrets that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Hidden among routine documents and forgotten by their owner were communications that exposed a web of financial corruption, political manipulation, and personal betrayal that reached into the highest levels of the royal household. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the countryside looked particularly beautiful as Isabella drove through rolling hills dotted with farms and small villages. She found herself thinking about her future role as a member of the royal family and the changes she hoped to bring about. The monarchy, she believed, needed to evolve to remain relevant in an increasingly democratic and transparent world. As she approached the village where the harvest festival preparations were underway, Isabella felt a sense of purpose and excitement about her unofficial inspection. The festival represented the best of Eldoria's cultural traditions, and ensuring its success felt like a meaningful contribution to her royal duties. She had no way of knowing that before the day was over, she would be forced to question everything she had believed about the people closest to her and the institution she was born to serve. The discovery that awaited her in the documents scattered carelessly on the passenger seat would force Isabella to grow up far more quickly than anyone had anticipated, transforming her from a curious teenager into an unwitting guardian of royal secrets that could destroy the very foundation of her family's reign. The village of Millbrook had been preparing for the harvest festival for weeks, and Princess Isabella could see the evidence of their hard work as she parked the palace sedan near the village square. Colorful banners stretched between ancient oak trees, and vendors were setting up stalls selling everything from handcrafted pottery to fresh apple cider. The scene filled her with pride in her people and excitement about the upcoming celebration. As she stepped out of the car, Isabella was immediately recognized despite her casual clothing and minimal security presence. The villagers' reactions were warm but respectful, reflecting the genuine affection most Eldorians felt for their royal family. Children waved shyly from behind their parents, while merchants proudly displayed their wares for the princess's inspection. Isabella spent the better part of an hour walking through the festival preparations, speaking with vendors, sampling local delicacies, and listening to concerns about everything from parking arrangements to weather contingency plans. Her genuine interest and practical suggestions impressed the villagers, who were accustomed to royal visits that felt more ceremonial than substantive. The festival coordinator, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, had served in that role for over 20 years and remembered Isabella as a small child who had always shown unusual interest in the celebrations. Mrs. Hartwell was pleased to see that the princess's enthusiasm had only grown with age, and she appreciated Isabella's thoughtful questions about accessibility for elderly and disabled festival-goers. As Isabella made her way back toward the car, she felt satisfied with her informal inspection and confident that the festival would be a success. The villagers had clearly put tremendous effort into their preparations, and their pride in the event was evident in every carefully arranged detail. She looked forward to returning for the official opening ceremony in 3 days. It was only when she settled back into the driver's seat that Isabella's attention was drawn to the papers that had been scattered on the passenger's seat when she first got into the car. Initially, she had assumed they were routine documents left behind by whoever had last used the vehicle. However, as she moved them aside to make room for the small bag of festival samples the villagers had given her, she noticed something that made her pause. The letterhead on one of the documents bore the seal of the royal treasury, and her own name was visible in the text beneath. Princess Isabella's natural curiosity was immediately piqued. She knew that various official documents related to royal activities and finances crossed many desks throughout the palace, but she had never seen anything with her name on it outside of ceremonial or educational contexts. What she read in those first few lines changed everything. The document appeared to be part of a correspondence discussing the management of funds that had been designated for her future education and royal duties. However, the amount mentioned bore no resemblance to anything Isabella had been told about her own financial arrangements. According to this document, substantial sums had been allocated for her benefit, yet she had no knowledge of these funds or how they were being managed. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she continued reading. The language was formal and bureaucratic, but the implications were becoming clearer with each paragraph. Someone had been managing significant financial resources in her name, making decisions about investments and expenditures that she had never been consulted about or even informed of. The amounts involved were staggering, enough to fund major charitable projects or educational initiatives that could have made a real difference in people's lives. As she shuffled through more of the scattered papers, Isabella found additional documents that painted an even more disturbing picture. There were investment reports showing funds being moved between various accounts, all apparently connected to her royal allowance and future inheritance. The pattern that emerged suggested that someone with access to these funds had been making unauthorized transactions, possibly for personal benefit. One document in particular caught her attention because it bore Queen Catherine's signature at the bottom. The document appeared to authorize the transfer of a substantial sum from Isabella's educational fund to an investment account managed by Whitmore Financial Services, a company that Isabella recognized as being connected to Queen Catherine's family business interests. The realization hit Isabella like a physical blow. The woman who had married her father and become her stepmother had apparently been using her position to gain access to royal funds, including money that had been set aside specifically for Isabella's future. The betrayal felt personal and political at the same time, striking at both her trust in her family and her faith in the integrity of the royal institution. Isabella's mind raced as she tried to process the implications of what she had discovered. If these documents were authentic, they represented not just a breach of trust, but potentially serious criminal activity. The misappropriation of royal funds was a matter that could have constitutional implications, especially if it involved the queen consort using her position for personal financial gain. As she sat in the car, trying to make sense of the papers, Isabella became aware that her radio was crackling with communications from her security escort. Captain Morrison's voice came through clearly, checking on her status and reminding her that she had been away from the palace for nearly the full 2 hours that had been agreed upon. His professional concern was evident, but Isabella detected something else in his tone that she couldn't quite identify. The drive back to the palace felt like the longest 20 minutes of Isabella's young life. The countryside that had seemed so beautiful during her morning journey now passed by in a blur as her mind struggled to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. The papers sat on the passenger seat like evidence of a crime, which she was beginning to realize they very well might be. As she approached the palace gates, Isabella faced a dilemma that would test her maturity and judgment in ways she had never been tested before. The documents in her possession potentially implicated Queen Catherine in serious financial misconduct, but they also raised questions about who else might be involved in the scheme. The fact that the papers had been left in a palace vehicle suggested that someone had been careless, or perhaps that the conspiracy was larger than it initially appeared. Isabella's first instinct was to take the documents directly to her father, but she quickly realized that such a direct approach could have serious consequences. If King Edmund was unaware of his wife's activities, the revelation could devastate him both personally and politically. If he was somehow involved or complicit, Isabella's discovery could place her in an extremely vulnerable position. The alternative that occurred to her was to approach Captain Morrison with what she had found. As head of the Royal Protection Service, Morrison was responsible for more than just physical security. His role also encompassed protecting the integrity and reputation of the royal family. Moreover, Isabella had always sensed that Morrison had reservations about Queen Catherine, though he had never voiced them directly. As she parked the sedan in the palace courtyard, Isabella made a decision that would prove to be one of the most important of her life. Rather than immediately confronting anyone about the documents, she would first make copies of everything she had found and then approach Captain Morrison for guidance. Her instincts told her that Morrison was trustworthy and that his long service to the crown made him the most appropriate person to help her navigate this dangerous situation. The weight of the discovery settled on Isabella's shoulders as she gathered the papers and prepared to enter the palace. She realized that her childhood was effectively over, that the innocent trust she had placed in the adults around her had been shattered by what she had learned. The institution she had been born to serve was apparently being corrupted from within by someone she had been taught to respect and obey. As she walked through the familiar corridors of the palace, Isabella saw everything with new eyes. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to watch her with expressions that appeared more judgmental than protective. The luxury that surrounded her daily life now carried the taint of potential corruption, raising questions about how much of the royal family's wealth had been legitimately acquired and managed. The confrontation that was to come would test everyone involved in ways they had never been tested before, forcing them to choose between personal loyalty and institutional integrity, between family harmony and justice, between the comfortable lies that had sustained them and the uncomfortable truths that threatened to destroy everything they had built. Princess Isabella's hands shook as she made photocopies of the incriminating documents in the small office adjacent to the palace library. The copying machine seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon, and she jumped at every sound in the corridor beyond. After ensuring she had duplicated everything, she carefully returned the originals to their scattered arrangement and placed them back in a folder exactly as she had found them. The weight of her discovery pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. These papers revealed a systematic pattern of financial manipulation that went far beyond simple mismanagement. Queen Catherine had apparently been using her access to royal accounts to funnel money toward investments that would benefit her family's business interests, all while maintaining the appearance of acting in the royal family's best interests. Isabella knew she needed guidance from someone she could trust completely, someone whose loyalty to the crown was beyond question. Captain Morrison had served her family for 12 years with unwavering dedication, and she had noticed his subtle discomfort around Queen Catherine during palace meetings. If anyone could help her navigate this dangerous situation, it would be him. She found Captain Morrison in his office reviewing security protocols for the upcoming Harvest Festival. His desk was organized with military precision, covered with schedules, floor plans, and communication protocols. When Isabella knocked on his door, he looked up with the professional smile he reserved for royal family members, though his expression quickly shifted to concern when he saw her pale complexion and nervous demeanor. Morrison gestured for Isabella to take a seat in the chair across from his desk. His office was functional rather than decorative, with maps of the palace grounds covering one wall and communication equipment taking up most of the available space. A single photograph on his desk showed Morrison in military uniform, receiving a commendation from King Edmund during his early years of service. Isabella struggled to find the right words to begin a conversation. How do you tell someone that you've discovered evidence suggesting that your stepmother is stealing from the royal treasury? How do you explain that the woman your father loves and trusts may be systematically betraying everything the monarchy represents? Morrison waited patiently as Isabella gathered her courage. His years of experience had taught him to recognize when someone was struggling with something serious, and his protective instincts were already alerting him to potential danger. He had sensed tension within the royal household for months, particularly regarding Queen Catherine's increasing influence over palace operations and her obvious displeasure with his continued leadership of the security detail. When Isabella finally began to speak, her words came out in a rush. She explained about borrowing the car, finding the documents, and realizing that they contained evidence of financial impropriety involving Queen Catherine. She showed Morrison the copies she had made, watching as his expression grew increasingly grave with each page he reviewed. Morrison's military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but what Isabella had brought him represented a crisis unlike anything he had faced during his years of royal service. The documents clearly showed a pattern of financial manipulation that could constitute criminal fraud if proven in court. More seriously, they implicated the queen consort in activities that could bring down the monarchy itself if they became public. As Morrison reviewed the evidence, he recognized some of the transaction patterns Isabella had identified. His security clearance gave him access to certain financial information related to royal protection costs and palace operations, and he had noticed some unusual expenditures over the past year that had never been adequately explained. At the time, he had assumed they were related to Queen Catherine's charitable work or personal staff expenses. Now, he realized they might have been connected to a much larger scheme. The conversation between Isabella and Morrison continued for over an hour as they worked through the implications of what they had discovered. Morrison's respect for the young princess grew as he witnessed her maturity in handling such a serious situation. Many adults would have panicked or acted rashly when confronted with evidence of corruption within their own family. Isabella, however, had approached the problem with remarkable thoughtfulness and discretion. Morrison explained to Isabella that their next steps would need to be planned very carefully. The evidence she had found was compelling, but it would need to be verified through official channels before any accusations could be made. Moreover, the political implications of exposing Queen Catherine would need to be considered carefully. The monarchy's stability depended on public trust, and any scandal involving the queen consort could have far-reaching consequences for the institution itself. As they discussed their options, both Isabella and Morrison became increasingly aware of how precarious their position had become. If Queen Catherine suspected that her activities had been discovered, she might attempt to destroy evidence or, worse, use her influence with King Edmund to discredit them before they could present their case. Morrison's military experience had taught him that the element of surprise was often crucial in dangerous situations, and this certainly qualified as dangerous. The security implications of the discovery were also troubling Morrison. If Queen Catherine was willing to betray the royal family's financial trust, what other boundaries might she be willing to cross? Her obvious desire to have Morrison removed from his position now took on a more sinister aspect. Perhaps her concerns about security protocols had less to do with professional disagreements and more to do with eliminating someone who might uncover her activities. Isabella found herself thinking about her father throughout the conversation with Morrison. King Edmund had seemed genuinely happy since his marriage to Catherine, and the thought of destroying that happiness with revelations about his wife's betrayal was almost unbearable. Yet Isabella also understood that allowing the corruption to continue would ultimately cause far greater damage to both her father and the monarchy he had devoted his life to serving. Morrison shared Isabella's concerns about King Edmund's reaction to their discovery. He had observed the king's obvious affection for his wife and knew that the revelation would devastate him both personally and politically. However, Morrison's primary duty was to protect the integrity of the crown, even when that meant protecting it from threats that came from within the royal household itself. As their conversation continued, Morrison and Isabella began to develop a plan for addressing the crisis. They agreed that they needed more evidence before approaching King Edmund with their accusations. Morrison would use his security clearance to investigate the financial transactions more thoroughly, while Isabella would try to gather additional information about Queen Catherine's activities without arousing suspicion. The plan they developed required Isabella to continue behaving normally around Queen Catherine, while secretly documenting any suspicious activities or conversations. Morrison would begin a discreet investigation into the financial irregularities, using his access to palace records to build a more complete picture of the scope of the corruption. They agreed to meet again in 3 days after the Harvest Festival to review their findings and decide on their next course of action. As Isabella prepared to leave Morrison's office, both of them understood that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. Once they began their investigation in earnest, they would be committed to seeing it through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal and political consequences. The comfortable world they had known within the palace walls was about to be shattered by the truth they had uncovered. Morrison's final words to Isabella carried both encouragement and warning. He praised her courage in bringing the evidence to his attention, but he also cautioned her about the dangers they now faced. Queen Catherine had demonstrated her willingness to deceive and manipulate for financial gain, and there was no telling how far she might go to protect herself if she realized her activities had been discovered. As Isabella left Morrison's office and walked through the familiar corridors of the palace, she felt the full weight of adult responsibility settling on her young shoulders. The carefree teenager who had driven to the village that morning to inspect festival preparations had been replaced by a young woman who understood that sometimes protecting the people and institutions you love requires making choices that will change everything forever. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test the loyalty and integrity of everyone involved, forcing them to choose between personal comfort and moral courage, between the preservation of comfortable illusions and the pursuit of difficult truths. The 3 days following Isabella's discovery passed in a haze of careful observation and growing tension. The Harvest Festival had been a tremendous success, with thousands of Eldorians celebrating their cultural heritage and demonstrating their continued affection for the royal family. King Edmund and Queen Catherine had presided over the opening ceremony with their usual grace and dignity, giving no indication of the storm that was brewing beneath the surface of palace life. During the festival, Isabella found herself watching Queen Catherine with new eyes, analyzing every interaction and conversation for signs of deception or manipulation. Catherine's performance was flawless, as always. She smiled warmly at children, spoke knowledgeably with local officials, and maintained the perfect balance of accessibility and royal dignity that had made her popular with many of Eldoria's citizens. Captain Morrison had used the festival as an opportunity to observe palace dynamics more closely while conducting his discreet investigation into the financial irregularities Isabella had uncovered. His security responsibilities gave him legitimate reasons to move freely throughout the palace and interact with various staff members, allowing him to gather information without arousing suspicion. What Morrison discovered during his investigation exceeded even his worst expectations. The financial manipulation was far more extensive than the documents Isabella had initially suggested. Queen Catherine had apparently been systematically diverting funds from multiple royal accounts, using her position and access to authorize transactions that benefited various business interests connected to her family. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Over the course of 3 years, millions of dollars have been redirected from charitable foundations, educational programs, and infrastructure projects into investment schemes that generated profits for companies owned or controlled by Catherine's relatives and associates. The money had been moved through a complex network of transactions designed to obscure the trail and make discovery unlikely. Morrison's military training and intelligence gathering proved invaluable as he pieced together the financial puzzle. He cross-referenced expense reports, authorization documents, and bank statements to build a comprehensive picture of how the scheme operated. What emerged was evidence of a sophisticated operation that took advantage of the trust and autonomy traditionally given to senior members of the royal household. The investigation also revealed that Catherine had been building a network of allies within the palace staff, people who either supported her activities or had been compromised into silence through various forms of leverage. Some staff members had received unexplained bonuses or promotions after demonstrating their loyalty to the queen consort, while others appeared to be staying quiet about irregularities they had witnessed. As the festival concluded and palace life returned to its normal rhythm, Isabella and Morrison met again in his office to review their findings. The evidence they had assembled was overwhelming and undeniable, painting a picture of systematic corruption that went to the very heart of the royal household. The question they now faced was not whether Queen Catherine was guilty of financial misconduct, but how to address her crimes without destroying the monarchy itself. Morrison had prepared a comprehensive report documenting everything they had discovered, complete with copies of financial records, transaction histories, and witness statements from staff members who had been willing to speak confidentially about what they had observed. The report was damning in its thoroughness and devastating in its implications for the future of the royal family. Isabella struggled with the emotional weight of what they had uncovered. The woman she had been taught to respect as a stepmother and future queen had betrayed not just her family, but the entire nation that trusted the royal family to act with integrity and honor. The betrayal felt deeply personal, but Isabella understood that her personal feelings were secondary to her duty to protect the crown and the people it served. The decision they faced was complicated by the political realities of their situation. Simply presenting their evidence to King Edmund would likely result in Queen Catherine's immediate removal from the royal household, but it would also create a scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation for generations. The alternative of attempting to handle the matter quietly risked allowing Catherine to continue her activities or to destroy evidence of her crimes. Morrison's recommendation was that they approach King Edmund immediately with their findings, despite the personal and political consequences. His years of service had taught him that problems of this magnitude only grew worse when left unaddressed, and his loyalty to the crown demanded that he protect it even from threats that came from within the royal family itself. Isabella agreed with Morrison's assessment, though she dreaded the conversation they would need to have with her father. She had seen how happy King Edmund had been since his marriage to Catherine, and she knew that the revelation of his wife's betrayal would devastate him both emotionally and politically. However, she also understood that protecting him from the truth would ultimately cause even greater damage. As they prepared to request a private audience with King Edmund, both Isabella and Morrison understood that they were about to trigger events that would change the royal family forever. The comfortable stability that had characterized palace life for the past several years was about to be shattered by revelations that would test everyone's loyalty and integrity. The confrontation they were planning would force King Edmund to choose between his personal happiness and his duty to the crown, between his love for his wife and his responsibility to the people he served. It would also test the bonds of trust that held the royal household together, potentially destroying relationships that had taken years to build. Morrison's final preparations included developing contingency plans for various possible outcomes of their meeting with the king. If Edmund chose to handle the matter quietly, Morrison would need to ensure that appropriate legal and financial safeguards were put in place to prevent further corruption. If the king decided to pursue criminal charges against Catherine, Morrison would need to coordinate with law enforcement agencies while managing the inevitable media attention. Isabella spent the evening before their planned meeting with her father thinking about the moment when everything had changed. The innocent drive to inspect festival preparations that had seemed so important 3 days ago now felt like a lifetime ago. The discovery of those scattered papers in the palace car had thrust her into an adult world of moral complexity and political consequence that she had never imagined. As she prepared for bed, Isabella reflected on the lessons she had learned about leadership and responsibility during the most challenging 3 days of her young life. She had discovered that sometimes protecting the people and institutions you love requires making choices that cause pain in the short term but preserve integrity in the long term. She had learned that true loyalty sometimes means challenging the people you care about rather than enabling their mistakes. The next morning would bring the confrontation that would determine the future of the Eldorian monarchy and test the character of everyone involved. The truth that Isabella had accidentally discovered would finally be spoken aloud, forcing all of them to face the consequences of choices that had been made in secret over the course of years. King Edmund sat behind his desk in the private study where he conducted the most sensitive royal business, reviewing diplomatic correspondence that had arrived with the Morning Post. The autumn sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated the oil paintings of his ancestors that lined the walls, their faces seeming to watch over the decisions that shaped Eldoria's future. The room had witnessed countless moments of crisis and triumph during the 3 decades of his reign, but nothing had prepared him for what his daughter and his most trusted security officer were about to reveal. When Princess Isabella and Captain Morrison requested the private audience, King Edmund had assumed they wanted to discuss security arrangements for upcoming state visits or perhaps Isabella's continuing education plans. The serious expressions on their faces as they entered his study, however, immediately indicated that something far more significant was troubling them. Morrison carried a leather portfolio containing the evidence they had assembled over the past 3 days. His military bearing was more pronounced than usual, as if he were steeling himself for a battle that would test everything he had learned about duty and honor during his years of service. Isabella walked beside him with a maturity that seemed to have emerged overnight, her usual teenage enthusiasm replaced by the grave demeanor of someone who had been forced to confront adult realities far sooner than anyone had expected. King Edmund gestured for them to take seats in the comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace, away from the formal atmosphere of his desk. This seating arrangement had always been his way of indicating that a conversation was personal rather than purely official, though the distinction would prove meaningless in light of what they were about to discuss. Isabella began the conversation by explaining how she had discovered the documents during her drive to inspect the festival preparations. Her voice remained steady as she described finding the papers scattered in the palace car and her growing realization that they contained evidence of serious financial irregularities. King Edmund listened with the patient attention he had always shown his children, though his expression grew increasingly concerned as Isabella's account continued. When Isabella finished her explanation of the discovery, Morrison opened his portfolio and began presenting the evidence they had assembled. His presentation was methodical and thorough, laying out the financial transactions in chronological order and explaining how each piece of evidence connected to the larger pattern of corruption they had uncovered. The documents told a story that became more damning with each page Morrison presented. Queen Catherine had systematically used her position and access to redirect royal funds toward investments that benefited her family's business interests. The scheme had been operating for nearly 3 years, beginning shortly after her marriage to King Edmund, and growing more sophisticated as Catherine became more confident in her ability to manipulate the palace's financial systems. King Edmund's face grew pale as he reviewed bank statements showing unauthorized transfers from charitable foundations that bore his name. Funds that were supposed to support educational programs for underprivileged children had been diverted to investment accounts controlled by companies owned by Catherine's relatives. Money allocated for infrastructure improvements in rural communities had been redirected toward real estate developments that would generate profits for Catherine's associates. The personal betrayal struck King Edmund even more deeply than the financial crimes. Catherine had violated not just the legal and ethical standards expected of royal family members, but also the trust and love he had given her as his wife. Every intimate conversation they had shared about royal responsibilities and public service had apparently been colored by her secret agenda to exploit her position for personal gain. Morrison continued his presentation with professional detachment, though he was acutely aware of the emotional devastation his revelations were causing the king. The evidence included recorded conversations with palace staff members who had witnessed Catherine authorizing suspicious transactions, as well as communications between Catherine and her business associates discussing how to maximize the profits from their access to royal funds. As the full scope of the corruption became clear, King Edmund struggled to reconcile the woman he had married with the criminal whose activities were documented in Morrison's report. Catherine had been a loving wife and a dedicated royal consort in public, winning praise for her charitable work and her efforts to modernize certain palace protocols. The revelation that her public service had been a facade covering systematic theft felt like a betrayal that cut to the very core of his identity as both a husband and a king. Isabella watched her father's reaction with a mixture of compassion and determination. She could see the pain in his eyes as he processed the evidence of his wife's crimes, but she also knew that his response to this crisis would define both his personal legacy and the future of the monarchy. The man she had always admired for his integrity and moral courage was being tested in ways that would require him to choose between his personal happiness and his duty to the crown. The conversation continued for over 2 hours as King Edmund asked detailed questions about every aspect of Morrison's investigation. His legal training, acquired during his years as Crown Prince, helped him understand the criminal implications of Catherine's activities, while his experience as a ruler helped him grasp the political consequences for the monarchy. Every question and answer made it clearer that there was no way to minimize the seriousness of what Catherine had done. Morrison presented several options for addressing the crisis, ranging from quiet resignation and restitution to formal criminal prosecution. Each option carried significant risks and consequences, both for the royal family personally and for the institution of the monarchy. A quiet resolution might preserve the monarchy's reputation, but could leave the impression that royal family members were above the law. Public prosecution would demonstrate the crown's commitment to justice, but could also expose the monarchy to scandal and ridicule. King Edmund's questions revealed the depth of his anguish about the situation. He asked about the possibility of Catherine being blackmailed or coerced into her activities, desperately searching for some explanation that might mitigate her responsibility for the crimes. Morrison's investigation, however, had found no evidence of external pressure or manipulation. Catherine appeared to have acted voluntarily, motivated by greed and enabled by the trust and access her position had given her. As the meeting continued, the conversation inevitably turned to the question of how long Catherine's activities had been ongoing and whether King Edmund should have detected the irregularities sooner. Morrison carefully explained that the scheme had been designed to exploit the autonomy and trust traditionally given to senior royal family members, making detection unlikely without the kind of detailed investigation that Isabella's discovery had triggered. Isabella found herself thinking about Queen Catherine's behavior during the festival just days earlier, remembering how natural and convincing her performance had been. The woman who had smiled at children and spoken eloquently about royal service had apparently been stealing from the very programs she claimed to support. The disconnect between Catherine's public persona and her private activities was staggering in its audacity. The most difficult part of the conversation came when King Edmund asked Morrison and Isabella for their recommendations about how to proceed. Both of them understood that their answer would shape not only Catherine's fate, but also the future direction of the monarchy. Morrison's military training inclined him toward decisive action and accountability, while Isabella's youth and idealism demanded that justice be served regardless of personal consequences. Their unanimous recommendation was that King Edmund could not ignore or minimize what they had discovered. The evidence of Catherine's crimes was too extensive and the betrayal too serious to handle quietly. They urged him to contact the appropriate law enforcement authorities immediately and to begin the process of removing Catherine from all official roles within the royal household. King Edmund's final question revealed the depth of his personal struggle with the crisis. He asked whether they believed Catherine could be given an opportunity to make restitution and seek forgiveness, or whether her actions had crossed a line that made redemption impossible. The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they believed about justice, mercy, and the responsibilities of leadership. The answer, when it came, would determine whether King Edmund was prepared to sacrifice his personal happiness for the integrity of the crown and whether the monarchy itself had the moral courage to hold its own members accountable for their crimes. The silence in King Edmund's study stretched for long minutes after his final question about redemption and forgiveness. The weight of 30 years of kingship seemed to settle on his shoulders as he stared at the evidence spread across the coffee table between them. Outside the windows, the palace gardens showed the first signs of winter's approach, leaves falling from ancient oak trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of monarchs for centuries. When King Edmund finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of a ruler who had made the most difficult decision of his reign. There would be no quiet resolution, no attempt to handle the matter privately to preserve the royal family's reputation. Queen Catherine would face the full consequences of her actions, regardless of the personal cost to him or the political implications for the monarchy. Morrison felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the king's decision. His years of military service had taught him that decisive action was usually preferable to indecision, but he also understood that the next few hours would trigger a series of events that would change the royal household forever. He immediately began making the necessary arrangements to ensure that Catherine could not destroy evidence or flee the country before the authorities could act. Isabella watched her father transform from a heartbroken husband into the sovereign ruler that Eldoria needed in this moment of crisis. The personal pain was still evident in his eyes, but his voice carried the conviction of someone who understood that the integrity of the crown was more important than any individual's comfort or reputation. His decision to pursue justice regardless of personal consequences demonstrated the moral courage that had made him a beloved and respected king. The confrontation with Queen Catherine began within hours of their meeting in the study. King Edmund requested that she join him in the same room where he had reviewed Morrison's evidence, though he did not initially reveal the purpose of the meeting. Catherine arrived with her usual grace and composure, perhaps expecting to discuss upcoming royal engagements or social events. Morrison positioned himself near the study's entrance, both to ensure security and to serve as a witness to the confrontation that was about to unfold. His presence immediately signaled to Catherine that this was not a routine royal meeting, and her expression shifted from casual interest to wary attention as she took in the serious atmosphere that filled the room. King Edmund began the confrontation by presenting Catherine with copies of the financial documents that had started the entire investigation. His voice remained steady and controlled as he explained how Isabella's discovery had led to Morrison's comprehensive investigation and the overwhelming evidence of systematic financial corruption that had been uncovered. Catherine's initial response was denial and confusion, claiming that she had no knowledge of the transactions being described and suggesting that there might have been some kind of clerical error or misunderstanding. Her performance was convincing, drawing on the same skills that had made her an effective royal consort and public figure for years. However, as King Edmund continued presenting evidence, Catherine's denials became less credible and her composure began to crack. Morrison had prepared for this moment by organizing the evidence in a way that made evasion or misdirection impossible. Bank records, authorization signatures, and recorded communications created an unassailable case that left no room for alternative explanations. The turning point in the confrontation came when King Edmund presented Catherine with recordings of her conversations with business associates discussing how to maximize profits from their access to royal funds. Her own voice, captured by palace security systems during what she had assumed were private meetings, provided undeniable proof of her criminal intent and active participation in the corruption scheme. Catherine's facade finally crumbled as she realized that her activities had been discovered and that no amount of denial or manipulation would allow her to escape the consequences of her actions. The woman who had charmed diplomats and impressed citizens with her royal dignity revealed herself to be someone capable of betraying the trust and love of the man who had made her queen. The emotional climax of the confrontation came when Catherine attempted to justify her actions by claiming that she had been trying to secure financial stability for the royal family in an uncertain economic climate. She argued that her investments would ultimately benefit the crown and that her methods, while unorthodox, were motivated by loyalty rather than greed. King Edmund's response to Catherine's attempted justification demonstrated the moral clarity that had guided his reign for 3 decades. He rejected any suggestion that theft and betrayal could be justified by good intentions, making it clear that her actions had violated not just legal standards, but the fundamental values that the monarchy was supposed to represent. Morrison watched the confrontation with professional detachment, though he was struck by the contrast between Catherine's earlier arrogance and her current desperation. The woman who had spent months trying to undermine his position and remove him from his role was now pleading for mercy from the very people she had betrayed and manipulated. Isabella, who had been granted permission to observe the confrontation, struggled with conflicting emotions as she watched her stepmother's downfall. The woman who had read her bedtime stories and attended her school events had revealed herself to be a criminal who had stolen from the very people she claimed to serve. The betrayal felt deeply personal, even as Isabella understood that justice demanded accountability. The practical consequences of Catherine's crimes became clear as Morrison explained the steps that had already been taken to freeze her access to royal accounts and notify law enforcement authorities. Assets that had been purchased with stolen funds would be seized, business associates who had participated in the scheme would be investigated, and Catherine herself would face criminal charges that could result in years of imprisonment. Catherine's final appeal was directed not to King Edmund's sense of justice, but to his love for her as his wife. She pleaded with him to remember the happy years of their marriage and to consider the damage that a public scandal would cause to the monarchy they both claimed to serve. Her words carried genuine emotion, though they could not undo the systematic betrayal she had perpetrated over years of marriage. King Edmund's response to his wife's final plea revealed the depth of his personal anguish and the strength of his commitment to his royal responsibilities. He acknowledged the love they had shared and the pain that her betrayal had caused him, but he made it clear that personal feelings could not override the demands of justice and the need to preserve the integrity of the crown. The confrontation concluded with King Edmund formally stripping Catherine of her royal titles and privileges, effective immediately. She would be given 1 hour to pack personal belongings before being escorted from the palace by security personnel. All official responsibilities and ceremonial roles would be transferred to other members of the royal household, and she would have no further contact with royal family members except as required by legal proceedings. Catherine's departure from the palace was conducted with the same discretion and dignity that had characterized her arrival years earlier, though the circumstances could not have been more different. The woman who had entered as a celebrated bride and future queen left as a disgraced criminal whose actions had shaken the monarchy to its foundations. As the palace staff began the process of adjusting to Catherine's sudden absence, King Edmund, Isabella, and Morrison found themselves confronting the aftermath of a crisis that had tested their courage, loyalty, and integrity in ways none of them had expected. The decisions they had made would define not only their own legacies, but the future direction of a monarchy that had survived by adapting to challenges and maintaining the trust of the people it served. The truth that Princess Isabella had accidentally discovered in a scattered pile of papers had ultimately prevailed, demonstrating that even the most powerful institutions must answer to the demands of justice and accountability when those who serve them betray the sacred trust placed in their hands.